All right. Welcome, everyone, to our October edition of Dr. Jaspersoft. Thank you guys for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come join us. We got a good session today. We're going to be talking about the REST API, some use cases, some customizations, ways to customize it and use it in your application. A couple of notes. My name is Mike Bilkowitz. I'm your host this week. We've got Jonathan Kano, one of my colleagues and good friends, joining us to do the presentation this week. Those of you that haven't noticed, it looks like many of you have already. There is a poll out there, as usual, to help us decide what to present in future sessions. So feel free to vote. It's multiple choice. You can vote as many topics that you see there that you'd like. And we will take those into consideration, of course, when we schedule our upcoming sessions. Also, if you have questions that come up during the session, please feel free to ask those using the Q&A button there at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can ask them in chat, but we prefer the Q&A section because we can track them a little bit better there. We usually save those questions until the end of the session, until after John is done with his presentation and demos. And then we will address those at the end of the session in totality. So again, welcome to everyone. Glad to have you join. I'm going to just start the slide deck here real quick. So like I said, we've got John on the call, and I guess, John, you know what, I'll just let you jump right in with the agenda yourself. And you can take over now. So welcome, John.
Good. Sounds good. So we're going to go through just some background on REST APIs and how they work with Jaspersoft Server, and then we'll actually do some demonstration of the REST APIs. And then I'm going to talk about customization. So if you need to create your own custom REST APIs. Just kind of get in the intro. So just a general overview, REST APIs are essentially APIs that are accessed via HTTP requests from the client applications. Particular methods for calling them: GET. So typically when you're doing the GET, that gives you a list or the ability to search or get information from Jaspersoft. Most of the time the structure of the that's responded from the GET will be the same structure you can post or use for puts, posts, and updates to the system. So post will create new resources and execute reports and so on. If you're going to be running reports through the synchronous API, for instance, you would use a GET. If you're going to be running reports through the asynchronous API, you'd be posting a body of JSON to the report executions API to actually execute the report. Then you have put. These are a lot of times is used for resources. So if you want to modify an existing resource in the system, or you can use the post to create a new resource, and use put to update it. And then finally delete. Delete will remove the resources from the system. Essentially what you're looking at is a URL that looks similar to this. This particular one is for bringing back all the input controls from the resources API. You'll have a host, what port it's on. So something like Jasper Server Pro, or something like that will come after it, depending on whether or not you're using Pro or non-Pro, which is Community Edition, then REST v2, and then resources for the Resources API, or some other extension off the REST v2 base for other APIs, okay? And now we're gonna just kind of go into demos. So I just want to explain how this actually works. For today's demo, I'm going to be hitting a 7.5 instance of Jaspersoft, and I'm going to just be running different APIs against it, just to show you what that might look like. I'm going to use Postman to execute it. For the authorization, there's different ways you can do authorization. I'm just going to keep it simple with actually I want to use super user here. I'm just going to use username, password for basic auth. And then what I'll do is in the headers, you can either accept JSON or you can accept XML. By default, you'll get responses in XML. And then you'll have the body of your request. In this particular instance, this is actually that's for a different call anyway. Get rid of that. But you'll have you could have a body if you're doing like a put or a post or something. In this instance, I'm just getting resources. If you want to get all resources, regardless of type, you can do this resources API, and you'll see you'll get back a list of resources. This had ad hoc views in it, report units, and some other types. If you go down here, you'll find something different. Eventually you will. But if you want a particular type, you just do question mark type equals, and then whatever type you want. So in this case, I'll just grab report unit. And that'll give you back a list of the report units. So report units are the actual reports that you execute. You'll see the URI here. You see some other information about the object from the resources. There are a lot of APIs out here though. That was for the, you might want to do users, for instance, if you want to go to a list of users. If I'm logged in as a super user and I do a list of users, I can get a list of users across different organizations. So you'll see I have the users information in here, if they're externally defined, just some other general information about them. Potentially some roles they have, whether or not they're in an organization for organization level users. And then if you want maybe all the users within an organization, you can do something like this. You just grab the organization you want, and then you would type in organizations, the organization you want, and the fact that you want the users. And that'll give you the list of users only for that one organization. If you want a particular user from that, you could also say, you know, I just want to know about Joe user. So instead of getting all these back, I can say I just want Joe user. You'll get back that one and only one user. Another example, actually, we'll come back to that later. So let's go ahead and let's look at the documentation on this. So there are a lot of different REST APIs out there. You'll see that in the documentation. These are the documented REST APIs. So if you wanted to export something from the server, import from the server, this is really used for CI/CD processes for builds and releases, or just moving content between servers, changing permissions on objects. A common one that gets used a lot is the resources APIs, the one I demoed a little while ago. So you just get a list of resources, search the repository for resources, create resources. You have report executions, which is the asynchronous execution of reports. And then you have reports, which is the synchronous execution of reports. This one, basically you pass in all your parameters on the request parameters in the URI. The report executions, you pass in your parameters in the body of the request. So if you wanted to request execution of a report, you could pass in what type of you know, actually that's a status. Let me get back up here. You can tell it, you know, you want to do a report execution, you want an asynchronous or synchronous, what type of output you want, you know, output format, you know, maybe you want PDF or so on. Basically, you tell it what you're looking for in terms of, you know, maybe only certain pages and so on. Input controls, there's an API for that. Options, jobs, this is for scheduling. Within the scheduler also, you'll notice in the bottom left-hand corner whenever you're scheduling a report. So if I was to go to repository, I go to schedule this guy here. The REST API will do the exact same thing as this create schedule here. And you can see if I change this recurrence type to a calendar, you can see things like holidays in here and such. So there's an API to update the holidays also. Query executor, the organization service. I use you kind of blend the organizations with the users when you want a particular user in a particular organization, which is what I showed earlier. You can also get a list of organizations. Attribute service, this is good if you want to set attributes. You know, attributes are a lot of times used for users, but they're also used on the server for things such as host name, port, and such for JVC connections and things like that. Finally, there are other things I want to talk about. If you go look at like the Application Security Pro web or even the Application Security web, there is an interesting thing you'll find in here. You'll find that there are listed in these list of REST APIs some other endpoints that you don't even see in the documentation. An example for that is dashboard executions. So when you create a dashboard in Jaspersoft, you can call that through Visualize.js. But if you just want to export that dashboard to like a PDF or PowerPoint or something, you can actually use the REST API and use the dashboard executions to execute that dashboard in an asynchronous mode. And even not shown in here, but it's also out there, is a /RESTv2/dashboards, which is also for executing dashboards in a synchronous mode, just like reports, report executions. You can do that for dashboards. For some reason, though, and I'm not real sure why, they're not actually documented on the website. So if you actually go look at the web documentation, you won't see dashboards or dashboard executions in here. So even though this is what's the documented REST API, do be aware that if you look at the source code or you kind of examine what's in the configurations in the server, there are additional APIs that are available to you. They're just not they're not typically used and they're not documented, but there are additional APIs. Okay. The final thing I want to talk about is customizations. So if we look at that, what I mean by that is, if you want to have an endpoint that is custom and either you want to extend an existing REST API that's already in our system, or you want to add some new functionality to our system and have it exposed through an API, you can extend existing endpoints. And I'm going to do an example. I had a client, what they wanted is they have multiple applications that potentially can hit Jaspersoft. They wanted in each of those applications to have the ability to have favorites so that a user can have a list of favorite reports or dashboards, whatever it might be, so that their applications could call to Jaspersoft and get that list of favorites. Now, we don't have a favorites capability within Jaspersoft inherently. We do have last run or most recently executed. So if you look, for instance, like on my home screen, on the top left, I'll see the more recently executed, items recently viewed, but there's not a favorites. So they wanted a favorites that could be on Jaspersoft, but they didn't want to put it in their application because the application, they use multiple applications, they would have to implement it in multiple places. So they asked to create a new endpoint for favorites, so that way that they could use the API layer, the REST API, to call and create new favorites for users, make favorites available, as a list, and be able to delete them if they want to remove those favorites. So you do have to do a bit of Java code here. You'll notice my package is hanging off of JAX-RS. Anything that hangs off of JAX-RS right here is going to get loaded into the as a REST API essentially, and it's going to get loaded at startup time. So this is much easier. If you look on the community site, you will find some documentation on how to create custom endpoints and have your own XML configurations so it doesn't just hang off the existing package. But if you use an existing package like this and you're extending an existing URI or path for the REST APIs, it's much simpler because you don't have to do any XML configuration. You don't have to do any additional, facades for the services. You simply have to implement the service. So what this service is actually going to do is it's going to expose a few endpoints. It's going to expose a get endpoint off of favorites. So resources favorites. When you execute a get, it'll get a list of your favorites. When you do a post, it'll add additional new favorites to the user's favorites. When you do delete, it can delete one in favorites from their favorites. So what does that actually look like? In order for this to work, we actually had to create a new table also. And that table is going to be used whenever a favorite comes in, or we store a favorite, we're going to use those favorites to basically store the information, and then that information gets written to this table. You'll notice the only thing I really have in this table are the IDs. The reason I do this is now if one of these resources was deleted from the server, because I only reference it by ID and I'm doing a join, whenever the resource or user or tenant is deleted from the server, immediately it will not show up in the favorites list. Even though it's in the favorites table, it won't show up in the favorites list. So the only thing is you probably need to clean up the favorites table every once in a while. The end result of all of this, though, is that you end up with a new API. So you'll notice that there's the resources API, which is already documented. And now I have a favorites hanging off of that. And when I do a get favorites, and I do that for super user, you notice there's nothing in there. For super user, there's some special security in this one that says if I use expanded equals true, this person, now I can see the favorites for everybody. So organization, Jasper admin 1. If I log in as just, let's see, basic. Oh. If I log in as just Jasper admin, I'll just get my Jasper admin only, and he'll get that. And so if he didn't have expanded, because he's not doing it as an administrator, he's just using it as a normal user, he'll get his favorites. Now to add a new favorite, you simply need to tell it the URI of what you want to add. And you can have this as an array, so you can have multiple favorites within this array. And you simply go ahead and post that. And now if I do a get, I can get all my favorites, my new favorites. And if I want to get rid of one of those and delete, and it's going to delete this URI out of my favorites. So when I look for the favorites again with a get, I'll see it's gone. So the idea is that a user can have favorites available through the REST API, and now any application that uses Jaspersoft could call this API to give a list of favorites into their application, so that each user could see their favorite reports and so on, and then that way they can quickly be able to run their favorite reports and have a tab for favorites. But the client wanted to make sure that this was available in Jaspersoft because they have multiple applications hitting that resources API. Okay. So again, just on customization, always kind of start. The easiest way to do it is always start with an existing package and just create your own custom class. Then when you're done creating that custom class, you put in a jar file and put that up on the server and the web INF lib directory in the server. And if you have anything that needs to be, you know, like for instance, the JDI name may or may not be JDBC Jasper server. But in order for this to work, I need to get to that favorites table. So I have the JDI name be configurable. So you'll notice in the Bean configuration, I actually create the little custom application context resources Bean configuration for this. And the only thing really in there is the one Bean for resources favorites, which references the new classes created and the JDI name. So that way, if the client was using a different JDI name for the Jasper server repository, you could swap that out right here, okay? Of course, I could add additional configurations if I ever wanted to, but that's just kind of an example. So that's the Bean configuration, the compiled code, and this is the customization for the custom endpoint using REST, okay? So we'll go back to the slides. All right. See, Q&A. All right, so we're at questions and answers. Does anyone have questions?
Yeah, nothing on the list there. If you guys have questions, feel free to use that Q&A section there and throw your questions in there for John or myself at this point. So John, I was curious, that Bean definition you showed there at the end, that's required even if you don't have properties, is that right? So you would still have to define the Bean.
No, actually you don't.
You don't,
okay. If I don't have any properties that I want to set, or I just want to assume, or if this is the default, but typically this is the default, if I deploy this jar file without this XML, the class will still load because it's in the existing package.
Gotcha.
If I create this in a custom package like com.jaspersoft.ps something, which is a custom package, then I have to go through the configuration on the bean, and I actually have to do additional configuration on the server and other XML files that already exist. This XML file does not exist already on the server. It's just completely custom for this one bean or this one class. But if I do not want to use the existing package, I have to do a lot more work. And actually in 7.51 or 7.8, I forget which one, there's the community website tells you how to do it if you want to have your own custom package. That doesn't work the same anymore. So the community site's not even up to date. So just so you know, this is by far the easiest way to go ahead and create custom endpoints, is just extend off of an existing package, whether it be .resources or .reports or something like that. Extend off an existing package. It's much simpler because then all you need is your jar file, because the system automatically loads any packages with JXRS whatever it might be, and it loads them as the REST endpoints.
So you just got to make sure your path there includes the original endpoint, that /resources on line 39, correct?
Yeah, you can do that. You can include the original resources and then your new path. You can also, I'm pretty sure it actually works like this even too.
Oh, if you took it out.
Rescue to favorites.
Excellent.
But I'm doing this as favorites for resources, so I extended it off the existing path. Now the problem is if you do this, what will go wrong is your security file. You'll have to make sure you add additional pieces in here for the security, because there is no endpoint security configuration for favorites.
Favorites.
So you go ahead and if you extend off an existing endpoint, you also inherit the security for that, so that way you don't end up with issues. So if I wanted something that was extremely secure that only super user could get to, for instance, maybe it was an administration task, I would probably extend off of diagnostics, because diagnostics is for super user only.
But you could always add your new extension to that security file.
Security, yeah, you can add to security, but again, that's more configuration. The nice thing about extending off an existing path like this is all I have to do is drop the file out there, the jar file. If it has no custom properties like this JNDI name, if it doesn't have that, or you just want to use the default, I don't need this XML file at all.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful stuff, John. I know we went very quickly from the very basic demos of easy, like, hey, this is how you use Postman to access your stuff, right into customizing your own endpoint, which is definitely what I would consider a more of a heavier customization in our system. But the nice thing, as John showed, is that it's quite easy to port this from version to version as well, because you'll have your standalone jar file and your and if necessary, a standalone XML file. So it's just something you keep track of when you upgrade. And I don't know, John, that our endpoints change all that often, right? So it's not something you have to deal with a whole lot on upgrades. I know that's always a big concern for people.
Yeah, and I have some REST resources that I wrote custom endpoints like this back in 6.3 that work fine in 7.8. So as long as you're not customizing the core class and you're creating your own custom class, but just extending it by setting it on the same package and off the path of the existing URI, you can maintain through versions. Okay. Let's go back to, there's something else in the slides. Just so y'all know, all the documentation is here on this link, and you'll also see that it's going to take you to this documentation. This documentation is pretty complete. However, what you might notice is that for the post or for the deletes or puts or whatever it might be, that you might not see the entire structure for each and every one of those examples. If you execute the get against the resource, whatever it might be, the response you're going to get back. So for instance, on the resources, this is the same package you would want to use for, or kind of format you want to use for other calls. Same with user. So if you want to create a new user, for instance, you would use a structure that looks essentially like this. So this way, if you ever have a question on what that structure looks like, you can execute the get in anticipation of doing a future post or put or whatever it might be. Other things you might want to look at, just make sure you can breeze through on the documentation here. is that you'll see in the overview, you'll see kind of a list of the resources of the REST endpoints and the different operations. So you might want to look through that. You notice that you can administer users with or without organizations, depending on where they are. If they're a user within an organization, you need to do with organization. If they're a user at the root level, for instance, then it can be without organization. Or if you're a super user, you can see all the users, for instance, so just /users. But all the documentation's in here. The default response, again, for all of these endpoints is XML. So you notice this is an XML response. The reason this is XML is the accepts. I didn't set anything in particular here. And if I leave it to the default of star.star or just don't pass in the accept, I will get XML. If you want JSON for your responses, do make sure that in your headers, that you do pass in that you want the accept to be JSON. There are some custom content types and accept types that you're going to need to know about also, and it's in documentation. For instance, if I was doing a scheduling of a job, I would use application/job plus JSON, because it needs to know that it's a job. It's not just JSON, but it's actually job JSON coming in. It's also a bunch of on the resources. There's some resource specific content types. So whenever you create a new report or a new input control, make sure you look at the resources. Let me show you real quick. You'll see that right here, resources descriptors. Within the resources descriptors for each of these, there's potentially a content type specific to that resource. So you see that right there, resource type and then the JSON, all right? Or XML. All right.
Hey, John, I got a question for you that I'm curious about. Can you talk a little bit about the login process with REST? I know you're using the basic auth in the Postman, but can you talk a little bit about the session ID and how that handles so you don't have to log in for every request if we didn't want to?
Yeah, if you're doing logins, let me see if I can, there's different ways of doing this actually. I don't want to go into that. Let's go back to the login service. That's funny. Where's
the authentication, I believe, right?
Authentication, yeah.
Third one.
Third one.
From the top.
And that's okay. Basically, it's REST v2/login, and then you pass in the information you want. There are different ways you can log in. You can log in with username, password on the arguments. That would be extremely insecure. You can also put in a token if you're using like a pre-auth token with PP equals and so on. You could implement your security model against OAuth or SAML or something like that. But the basic one is just like this. It's REST v2, login, J_username, user ID, then organization. And they have %7c in here because it's URL encoded. That's just a vertical pipe, ampersand, and then password equals password. So that's how the basic login. What you'll notice is that the set cookie is coming back to JSession ID. Make sure you repeat the cookies on every subsequent call, that once you establish a session with login, that cookie will handle making sure that your session, it knows what session to address. So then make sure you're repeating the cookies on the subsequent calls, okay?
Yeah, really important point if you've got a thorough login process. It saves on performance, right, John? So you know, reuses that same session if you're making a lot of REST calls, which can help.
Yeah, and I mean there are times when you know, if you do pass in the username password each and every time, it'll work. It's just not as efficient. So if you can maintain the session, and then you can do that. And just so y'all know, I didn't really go into it in the documentation here. There are libraries out there for calling the REST APIs. There's Java libraries out there that'll make this a lot easier. So if you're in a Java development shop, you can pull down the client libraries. Just search for Jaspersoft Java REST client library or something like that. Now you should find it right away. The one you really want is the latest one, Jaspersoft Java REST client. You'll see it pretty much is right here on the community site. And then you'll see here's the actual code and the releases. If you're going to be doing a bunch of calls and you don't want to sit there and, you know, create the code for each and every one of those actual REST calls, you can use the libraries and then call it directly. There are some older versions of these libraries that work with other languages, but there, you can do that. And I also know that, you know, I've created some clients for other clients writing this in C#. Works just fine because it's still just a REST call at the end of the day behind the scenes. But this is a really good tool to use if you're going to do a bunch of REST calls and you're in a Java shop. Just go ahead and pull down the release for the REST clients, and they're out here. Even though it may say an older version like this, it probably still works. The API endpoints really haven't changed much, so this will work fine with the 7.5 release and such. Okay. You can also use this for, what's really good about using these REST APIs is if you want to script out, for instance, the release for CI/CD processes, you can use the REST APIs to handle all your push and pulls of resources, either to pull them in the Git or to push them from your Git repository to the server. I have several scripts I've used for other clients where either through batch scripts or through using this Java library, you can script out the processes to pull the resources down from the server to your Git or push them from Git to your server. Okay. Any other questions?
Got nothing on the list here, John. I think that's probably good. We're a little over time anyway at this point, okay. Which is fine. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. I put in the chat window, I put some links to the things that John referenced today. We will make sure those links are also updated on the slides. The first link that I put is actually an internal community wiki article website that has a link to all of our previous sessions and the slide decks in there. So I've just added those all there, and John's session will be up shortly after this session ends, this session today. If you guys have further questions, you can always, you can always send an email to Dr. Jaspersoft at tipco.com. And I do want to make a little plug for next month's session. We try to do this the second Thursday of every month. The next one, yours truly will actually host and present. That's customizations in Jaspersoft Server. So November 12th of next month. And again, Dr. Jaspersoft at tipco.com. If you have any further questions, or if you're an existing Upshift customer and you have a customer success manager, you can always reach out to them if you have specific questions about the things you saw today, or maybe you think of something a little bit later on. So any of those ways, we're very open. There's also a way to tag us on the community wiki site if you ask a question and do a hashtag Dr. Jasper. That comes to me as well. So lots of ways to get to us. Thank you very much, John, for the session today. I think it was really helpful, and hopefully you all found it useful. And thanks for voting, and we'll see you again hopefully at the next session. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.